Wow, that's big. All right. So we've been in the Gospel of Mark. We've been walking with Jesus in there, just trying to figure out what's going on. And so far, like last week, I mentioned that Jesus came and was picking a fight with sort of the religious system. And I showed you that that's true, right? Like everything Jesus did over and over again made them mad, and he knew it would. He knew that these things would be, out of sorts for them, and they would just keep getting more and more mad at him. And so he was picking a fight. And another way of looking at that is, like God intended to sort of plant His people in the earth like Descanso. You ever been to Descanso Gardens? I went there when I was a kid on a field trip. I haven't been there since, but when I went there, I think it was a beautiful flower place, right? Just flowers everywhere, beautiful and fragrant and colorful. Can you get that in your mind? That's what God wanted His people to be like. It's sort of like a light into the nations. He wanted them to be a place of peace and a place of beauty and fragrance. That's what He wanted. But when Jesus came, what did He find? He found Mojave and a bunch of tumbleweeds. Get that in your mind. Anybody ever been to Mojave? California City, the desert, right? That's what He found. And so he had to come in and sort of uproot these tumbleweeds so He could plant flowers. That's sort of what He's coming to do. We talked about Him having to bind Satan and tie him up so he could the strong man's house, so He could take over that house and really liberate God's people. That's what Jesus is coming to do, and we see that in the Gospel of Mark. And so we've talked about some of the weeds that have had to be pulled up. One of the weeds was the concept that Israel had of their Messiah. We've talked about this, a messianic secret in Mark. It's weird when you're reading the Gospel of Mark, especially the first half of the book. Just about everybody who comes in contact with Jesus, who's healed or cleansed or some miracles done, and they just want to go tell everybody about Jesus, and Jesus says what? Shut up. No, He doesn't say it rudely, but He tells them don't say anything to anybody, right? It's really weird because we know, hey, we should go tell everybody about Jesus. No, don't tell anybody about Jesus. That's a messianic secret, and it's because the Jews expected like Conan the Barbarian. Anybody remember him? Some of you. How about the Hulk? The Jews expected the Hulk to come raging in and kick out all the enemies and get rid of all Rome and everybody and set the Jews up as the cool people on the earth. They expected this, but they didn't get the Hulk. They got Barney the purple dinosaur. And you may think that doesn't fit, but how many of you know the song? I love you, you love me. We're a happy family with a great big hug and a kiss and a hug for me. Something like, won't you say you love me too? I didn't watch it, but I remembered people got really irritated at that song. But what part of that song doesn't fit the church or God's will for His people or the nature of the gospel? What part of that song is wrong? That is what the Messiah was to be about. To bring a message of the love of God. Isn't that what the gospel is? A message of God so loved the world He gave His only Son. But they wanted the Hulk. So that's a weed that had to be yanked up so that the flower could be planted. Another weed we've talked about is that if you were blind or lame or if you were leprous, if you were sick in some way, or if you were even poor, then you were being told by this system that God is mad at you and He's punishing you and He doesn't like you. That's a weed. That's a tumbleweed. That's not how Jesus treated people, is it? He came and loved and healed and served and saved, and He was all about lifting up the downtrodden. And so there was a weed that had to be removed. It was a tumbleweed, and flowers were put in its place. And even the sinners, they were given the impression that God didn't want anything to do with them, and nobody should hang around them. It's like they were leprous, and they needed to know that God was mad at them. And then Jesus came and did what? He came and He was eating and drinking with them. He called a tax collector to be one of His disciples. This whole mentality was a weed that had to be ripped up so that God's garden could be planted, something beautiful, something fragrant, something lovely. And that's what's going on so far in the Gospel of Mark. But it doesn't stop there. What happened to that scripture I had? I don't need it. All right. In your Bible, in the Gospel of Mark chapter 2, that's probably up there now, but I'm not going to rely on it. Listen to this, because there's another weed that has to be removed. Okay? Well, let me say this. My family, we went and saw A Bronx Tale. Anybody remember that with Robert De Niro? We saw it at Pantages. A little rough, but pretty good message, pretty good musical. But I noticed sitting there and watching the scene, so the story's about this little boy named Calogero. What's that? I don't know, but it's a weird name. But Calogero, if I'm saying it right, his dad is Lorenzo. He's a bus driver. He's a good man. And when the boy drives with him in the bus, everybody loves his dad. That was played by Robert De Niro back in the 90s. But anyway, Lorenzo is his dad. He's a good man, and he wants a good life for his son. And his son idolizes his dad, plays ball with him, and knows he's a good man. And that it all works until he comes in contact with Sonny. And Sonny is like, he's the guy who runs the streets in the neighborhood. He runs the whole neighborhood. And so he sort of takes this boy under his wing, and the boy sort of starts idolizing Sonny. And the boy thinks everybody loves Sonny because they all listen to him, they laugh at his jokes, they're always around him, they do stuff for him. And there's a place in the musical, there's a place in the production where the dad, Lorenzo, is trying to explain to the boy that you either live in relationships with people based on love or based on fear. And he was trying to explain that those people that he has around him on the bus, they love him. They love him because who he is. He's a good guy, he's an honest, hardworking guy, and he does his job well, and he's kind to them. They love him. But the boy doesn't understand that all these people surrounding Sonny, they don't love him. They what? They fear him, because if they step out of line from his rules, they might get killed or just beat up with a bat or something. But the boy doesn't get it at first. And so the story is sort of his journey to come to understand that it's really relationships based on love that are meaningful. Those based on fear, nobody really cares. When Sonny ends up dead in a box at the end, those guys who he thought, who Calogero, I don't remember how to say his name now. Anyway, C, they called him. Those guys that C thought loved Sonny were standing around laughing and just having a big old joke. And so he could see it's not fear, it's love that makes real relationship. But what happens in religion is that God keeps being presented as a God who wants you to serve him out of fear. Like, you better do it or else. If you don't do it, he's gonna beat you up forever. Now, which is right? Is God wanting to have a relationship with humanity based on fear? Or is that a weed that needs to be uprooted because God really wants the relationship to be based on love? Well, that is going to be seen in these next couple of passages. So this is what I want to read to you. In verse 18, chapter 2 of Mark. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, to Jesus, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" So let me start with that. So that's the question. Why aren't your disciples fasting? Well, how do they know they don't fast? Maybe they fasted yesterday or 3 days ago, right? How do they know? Well, part of the scene is this apparently is a day of fasting for the religious leaders. It's sort of one of those ritual days. Remember, the guy says, "I fast twice a week," right? And I give a tenth of all I get, that kind of thing. Well, they had like a weekly fast. I think it was Monday and Thursday, 2 times a week. And it was a ritual. You just did it. And we also know that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, yeah, you might fast, but don't fast like them. Because it was just, hey, everybody, look at me. So there's something about what's going on there that we're going to have to pay attention to. But they want to know why your disciples aren't fasting. And we know they're not fasting right now, because even though this is a day that everybody's fasting, Jesus and his disciples are eating and drinking with the sinners. They're already mad about that. But once Jesus says, hey, I came to seek and save the lost, now they're like, okay, well, all right, you're eating, but you shouldn't even be eating and drinking. You're supposed to be fasting. Okay? So why don't your disciples fast? That's the question. And Jesus' answer is fairly simple answer. He says to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. Okay. Now we might go, we could kind of build a case about Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is his bride, and they're going to kill him, so he's going to be gone. But all of that's all great, but it's not necessary to his answer. Basically, his answer is, hey, Jesus, why don't your disciples fast like the rest of us? And his answer is, well, it's not appropriate for them to be fasting right now. When it's the appropriate time, they'll be fasting. Does that make sense? Like right now, they shouldn't be fasting because there's sort of a celebration going on. But later, when that celebration's over and there's something else going on, then they'll fast because it'll be a time of fasting. You get that? It's a simple answer. They're not fasting because it's not time. Okay? But then he gives some more answer, a couple of parables. And the parables, they don't just say what he just said. They say something more. They say something bigger. And we have to figure out what that is. Because they're both kind of duh. If you listen to them. Like, well, okay, duh. Maybe not duh to us, but duh to them. Okay, here, look at how that happens. He says in verse 21, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. Now everybody say duh. Has anybody, you ever buy a t-shirt, but you didn't realize it hadn't been pre-shrunk, and it fit perfectly like when you tried it on, so you're like, yay, my favorite t-shirt, and then you get it home, you wash it, and now it's on your cat. You know what I mean? Because it's like, what is this, right? It wasn't pre-shrunk, and so now it's like this big. So you know that. Now, I don't know if anybody patches stuff anymore, but if in fact you took a piece of cloth, or if you even just had a patch that was somehow not pre-shrunk, and you put it on a shirt that you liked, you want to put a patch on it, and the shirt was already pre-shrunk, what's going to happen? You're going to get that thing out of the dryer, and maybe it didn't rip the cloth, but it certainly would have pulled it all together, and you'd have this big crunch, right? You know what I mean? So Jesus is saying nobody does that, and really it's like, well, duh, right? There's no great wisdom in that, no great secret. It's just like, well, okay, don't do that. We all know that. And what does that have to do with fasting? Right? It's like, what's going on? Well, he does it again. There's another one. He says, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Well, I don't know if any of us actually do this, but they used to sort of empty out a goat carcass. Is that kind of gross? I was a meat cutter, but I never did that. But they'd empty it out, and they'd tan it or whatever, and make it useful and for a wine skin, and they would fill it with wine and seal it all up. And then the fermentation and the carbon dioxide and all that would cause it to swell, and the skin would swell, but because it was a fresh skin, it would had a lot of pliability to it, and that was fine. But you couldn't keep doing that because at some point that skin no longer has any stretch in it. And so what happens? It bursts. Everybody say, duh. Because it is, right? I mean, if you're in a culture that does this, you already know this. And so, no, don't do that. That's dumb. Don't put the cloth on there like that. Don't put the wine in there because that's dumb. What does that have to do with fasting? That's the part we have to figure out. Okay? Because fasting is not old wine or new wine. Fasting is not old cloth or new cloth. So what in the world is Jesus saying? So this is why we get back to the idea of the ritual of fasting. Let's go back and think about that again. They came and said, why aren't your disciples fasting? And what they meant was, there is a kind of group-wide ritual fasting going on where all of the religious people who honor God and love God and who are religious, they all go through those motions because that's what we're doing right now. We're fasting. And Jesus' answer seems to be, my disciples aren't doing it that way. They're not just fasting because it's some kind of an ordinance, a rule, go through the motions. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is sort of a religious thing that has to do with what's really going on in their lives. Like something real, like right now, they're happy their Messiah is here, and they're happy to be part of this movement. But there'll come a time when they're sad because he's taken away, and then they'll fast. But it'll be something real. You get that? It'll be something meaningful, something that has to do with real life. And so it appears that these little parables are simply to say, my disciples we're not mingling with this old kind of ritual, rote, go through the motions type of religion, type of sort of legalistic relationship with God kind of thing. It's not that. It's going to be real. It's going to be something meaningful, something more beautiful than that. Okay? Now, so then he goes on. Or he doesn't go on, but the next story seems to highlight this even more. And this is where it gets really uncomfortable. Were any of us uncomfortable when Jesus touches the leper, knowing that's sort of against the letter of the law? Does that make anybody uncomfortable? It made them uncomfortable. Well, what about this? It goes on. It says in verse 23, one Sabbath he was going through the grain fields. As they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? According to religious leaders, Jesus' disciples are breaking the law. Now, what are they talking about? Maybe they're talking about, hey, these guys are out there harvesting grain. That's work. You shouldn't be harvesting grain on the Sabbath because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, right? But, they're not really harvesting grain, and that's kind of being nitpicky, and Jesus might just say, you guys are a bunch of morons because that's, nitpicky, and they're not harvesting grain, they're just grabbing a few kernels to eat. But that's not really what's going on, probably. Does anybody remember when the law of the Sabbath for gathering manna? Anybody remember that? And so he tells them specifically, you go out every single day and you can gather manna. On Friday, what do? You gather twice as much. Why? Because the thing that you cannot do is gather your food on what day? On the Sabbath. Do the Pharisees have a case here? Seems like they do, if we're honest. What were Jesus' disciples doing on the Sabbath? They were gathering something to eat. Here's what's fascinating. We expect, when Jesus answers their accusation, we might expect Jesus to say something like, well, you guys are just a bunch of literalists and you're legalists and you're sort of just kind of, making up rules where God didn't make up rules. Did they do that stuff sometimes? Yes, they did that a lot. And we might expect Jesus is saying, that's what you're doing now. You're sort of making it up. And we're not really breaking God's law. We're just breaking your way of making law. But he doesn't say that. we might expect Jesus to defend himself in some way by saying, it's not really breaking the law by doing what they're doing. But I want you to listen to Jesus' answer and see if he denies the accusation. They're saying your disciples are breaking the law. Listen to his answer, and there's going to be a quiz. I want you to decide for yourself, does Jesus deny the accusation in his answer? Does he say, no, you're wrong, it's not true? And so he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave to those who were with him. Was David a priest? David was not a priest. Was it lawful for David to eat the bread of the presence? It was not lawful for David to eat the bread of the presence, which was only for the priests. Is that holy bread? Is holy bread? Is Jesus saying you're wrong, we didn't break the law? Is he saying you're wrong, my disciples didn't break the law? Is that what he's saying? See, this might be uncomfortable for us because of the way we think about law. But he's not saying you're wrong, they didn't break the law. He's saying, King David somehow thought it was okay to eat this bread and give it to his men, knowing there was a law that said he couldn't. How is that possible? What's going on that's okay if it's okay? Now, before I answer that, I just want to point out something that may be in my head. I may be making it up. I don't think I am, but I just, you ever read along in the Bible and it reminds you so strongly of some other story? Like I'm reading in 1 Corinthians 3 and I hear about somebody who built with wood, hay, and straw and barely is saved, escaping through the flames, and I can't help but think of Lot. I mean, the story just goes with it. Here, just think about this parallel. Why did he choose King David? There's all kinds of examples. Like in another place, I think he uses the idea of the priests. When a baby's born on the Sabbath, and the 8th day of his life is on the Sabbath, the priest has to work and circumcise that baby. Do you know that? Yeah, because the circumcision law is higher, so he has to do it. Jesus could have answered with that, but he doesn't. He chooses to answer with when David broke the law. But there's just a weird kind of coincidence going on here. King David and his men, why were they out there running around in the first place? Isn't this the story where they were being persecuted by King Saul, who is God's representative of his people on earth? Isn't that God's ruler of his people, King Saul? And King Saul is persecuting King David and chasing him around, and David and his men don't have food and they're hungry, and so they end up eating this bread that's unlawful. Now take that whole story and lay it over what's happening right here with Jesus. Isn't Jesus the son of David? Isn't he the Messiah coming as the son of David? So now you got Jesus, the son of David, King Jesus, with his men, and they are going through and they're eating what's unlawful to eat. But there's another piece going on. They're also being persecuted and hounded and chased around by those who are in charge of God's people and who are God's representatives on earth, aren't they? That's what Mark's been about the whole time. And so I don't know if they saw this, but it seems to be Jesus was putting the religious leaders in the place of King Saul. You get that? It's just the stories go together too nicely. And it's like he's indicting them. Can't you guys see where you're at? You're in the same place. I can't prove it. But it's interesting that the stories fall so parallel to each other. But anyway, getting back to Jesus' answer. His answer is, the best I can understand it, his answer is that the law of life, somehow David understood that God was more concerned about David's life than he was about that bread, the law about the bread. Does that make sense? We don't like it because it almost feels like situational ethics, or however you call that, right? We don't like people to have that kind of freedom. But it does sound to me like that's Jesus' answer. That God understands that David's life, or somehow David understood that his life and the life of his men, those lives were more important to God than the law of the bread of the presence. Now, was David just willy-nilly ignoring God's law? Like, hey guys, hey, here's some bread, let's just go eat it. Who cares about God's law? Was that what's going on? No, of course not. That would be wrong. And so what's going on in this answer? Jesus answers, he says, here's the therefore. In verse 27, and so he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, because the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. His answer is not, you're wrong, I didn't do it, or you're wrong, they didn't do it. That's not his answer. His answer is, you're wrong because you don't understand the way law works. You're wrong because you think that God he set up a law, and he's testing you to see if you're going to respect him enough to keep that law no matter what. And if you don't, he's going to boot you out. That's the God that they're representing. And Jesus is coming and he's saying, you're misunderstanding something. What in the world was the Sabbath in the first place? Was it supposed to be a religious burden? Was it supposed to bind this heavy burden on people's backs that they just couldn't bear, fearing that they might break the Sabbath? Or was it supposed to be a day of rest? A day of family and community and rest? A day to hamstring the money god. Because if people could, they'd be making money 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The Sabbath was made for man. And so God's heart is for man, not for the law. It's for man. And he gives the law for the sake of man. And so, and the Jews sort of knew this. They understood this better than I think we do. Have you ever heard the law? Let's just take one law for an example. You ever hear the law of levirate marriage? Anybody familiar with the law of levirate marriage? A couple of us. How about the kinsman redeemer? Anybody know that story? Anybody familiar with the book of Ruth? You know the book of Ruth? That whole situation? Naomi has a daughter who has no husband because the husband died. Her son died. And so we need to find a husband for Ruth. Isn't that right? She needs a husband. Where do we look for her husband? Well, we go looking for the nearest relative, the kinsman, to redeem her. And the guy who won't redeem her doesn't even get a name in the book. Every main character is named, but the guy who doesn't redeem her is called Plony Almoni. Sounds like phony baloney. And he was phony baloney, and he was treated like that. Plony Almoni just means John Doe. Mr. Nobody, Mr. No Name. And he was treated that way because he wouldn't redeem her. And so he was kind of disrespected because he wouldn't redeem her. Now understand this. He had no legal obligation whatsoever to redeem her. The levirate law of marriage, levirate is not based on the word Levi. Levirate simply means the dead husband's brother. One of the brother-in-law situations. That's all levirate means. The brother-in-law. This guy was not a brother-in-law. He had no obligation under law to marry Ruth. And yet by this time, he did. Why? Why? How did levirate law become kinsman redeemer law? Because the people understood that they were looking at the intention of God's law. When God made the levirate law, He was trying to save the widow and her inheritance, right? So God makes this law that says if the husband dies, his brother should take his place, provide a child for that widow under the dead brother's name, so that family name can press on into the generations to come. And the inheritance will continue. That was the law. That was God's grace for that widow. But what happens when the guy who dies is an only son? The law didn't make provision for that. But what happens? See, the Jewish community understood when there isn't a brother-in-law, shall we just let the widow suffer? Shall we just let the inheritance die and take it away and give it to someone else? Was that the intention of God? No. They understood the heart of God enough to know if the guy dies and he has no brother, we need to keep looking. Is it what the law said? No. But it's what they did. And it was right. Can everybody see that? It was right. It was right to try to get this woman, a child, a son, to take up the name and preserve the inheritance. That was the intention of the law. But it wasn't the letter of the law. And this is a weed that Jesus came to uproot. This idea of the letter of the law thing that created heavy burdens on people and did not represent the love of God. To sum that up, you remember when Jesus is hanging out with the woman at the well? And he says to her, I tell you, woman, a time is coming, and now is, when you will not worship God in this mountain or in Jerusalem. Was he saying that people aren't going to ever worship God in Jerusalem or in Samaria again? Was he saying that? Because it sounds like it. The time is coming and now is, and you're not going to worship here or there. Maybe just her or nobody is allowed to ever worship again in Samaria or Jerusalem. Does that make any sense? Of course not. It's not what he was saying. But he says the time is coming when the true worshiper will worship how? In spirit and in truth. The true worship he's talking about is worship in spirit. It's worshiping according to reality. Not form and function and ritual and go through the motions kind of rote thing. It's not that. My disciples will fast when there's a reason to fast. And they will celebrate when there's a reason to celebrate. And they will say, praise the Lord when there's a reason to praise the Lord. And they'll say, God, what the heck is going on? When there's a reason to say, God, what the heck is going on? And they will give when they recognize their God as a giving God. And they will serve because they see their God as a serving God. And they'll be generous because they realize how generous God has been to them. And they will forgive because they see how much God forgave them. That's reality. That's a relationship with God in spirit and in truth. And that's what Jesus says. We're not going to mix that with those old crusty wineskins. But it keeps happening. Religion keeps doing it. They did it in the time of Jesus, and for 2,000 years, the people of God have continued to do it. They miss the garden that Jesus is trying to plant, the beautiful garden, and they settle for tumbleweeds. Will you pray with me? Father, yank those weeds out of our hearts. Help us to see the kingdom that Jesus is and came to bring. Father, help us to find ourselves in the freedom of your love. Not freedom to do bad, but freedom to do good on every occasion. Father, open our eyes. Open our eyes to your presence in our lives. Open our hearts to praise you for your awesomeness. And continue to give us wisdom and understanding as we study your word. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. If you want to respond this morning to the message, we're going to have a time when one of our elders are going to come forward, and you can pass cards into the center. You can come up and talk to us and let us know what's going on. We'd love to pray for you. We'd love to be of service to you in any way we can. And so if you have those cards, pass them to the center. And let's stand up while Ken leads us in a song.